Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, Coffee Break Sessions, presented by Strategic Treasurer. The show where we cover foundational topics and core Treasury issues in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your cup of coffee. I'll be your host, Jonathan, Media Production Specialist here at Strategic Treasurer, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. We are back with another coffee break session with Christin Cifaldi, Director of Product Development and Analytics at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back, John.
Today we are talking about scoping. And now I've heard about scoping for you go in and you scope out the party, see who's there, but I don't know if that's what we're talking about today. What is scoping in the context of cybersecurity?
So it's basically the same thing. When we're talking about scoping in cybersecurity, we're talking about reviewing a list of our security baseline controls and selecting only those controls that apply to the IT system you're trying to protect. So we're limiting what we're evaluating. This is important when you're coming up for specific system audits, such as PCI DSS or Swift CSP. And scoping would be the first step in a cybersecurity risk assessment procedure. So just like when you walk into a party, look around, check out if it's the scene you want to be at, or you leave. When we're scoping for our cybersecurity risk assessments, we're identifying only relevant items and leaving the rest.
So shopping.
Yep.
Well, you mentioned one of the pieces that makes this important. What else is important about scoping?
Treasury departments are often targeted for cybercrime due to the large dollar value of payments being processed and direct access to bank account information held within those departments. As treasurers, we would like to collaborate directly with our cybersecurity teams to recognize potential issues and respond effectively. So while we're scoping, we'll get a task force together to document and clarify information, people, software, hardware, telecoms, and physical assets in scope. Knowing and limiting the scope of controls will help limit scope creep and keep project costs and time in check. So the most important thing about scoping is to make sure we have the relevant items identified and we're not going outside of our swim lane for this. So if we're in Treasury, we're just focusing perhaps on our TMS, our payment systems, our general ledger systems, and we're not necessarily going into anything that our sales team might be checking into. Those things should be segregated so that we can spend time only looking at the processes relevant to the current cybersecurity assessment.
You said scope creep. What is that?
Scope creep applies to many different areas of businesses, not just IT and cybersecurity. And it's when we start to add in extra items that are unnecessary. As I briefly mentioned, if we're looking at treasury departments and items used by the finance department, we don't want to start looping in our marketing, our sales, other things that aren't related, other tools and systems. That would be scope creep once we start to bring in unrelevant things.
That sounds interesting. There's a lot of conversation about not wanting your company to be built in silos, but there's the other side of that, which it sounds like scope creep is you need to keep some stuff separate, finding the right balance in that.
Yeah, so we certainly don't want our people to be in silos, right? We want people who have to be working as teams to be able to have access to each other, whether that's physical or knowing someone's in the office and communicating. However, we don't want our systems. So our systems can live in silos. Whereas if you're working in the customer service department, you don't need to access the treasury management system. We can silo that, but our treasury personnel might want to call down to customer service and check on a vendor payment, for example.
That makes sense. At the beginning, you talked a little bit about getting ready for a Swift CSP attestation, I think it was called. Do you have any other examples of how scoping is useful for updating your security landscape?
Yeah, so scoping would be useful whenever you're doing an internal annual review of the security of any system. Swift CSP that I mentioned is a mandatory assessment that you would have to do for an outside party. It would also be important when your IT folks are updating their incident response plan annually to meet with stakeholders and determine the scope of impacted systems for that with each stakeholder group. So just annual, as part of the annual planning process and making sure we're checking on our systems in the right manner.
Any final thoughts or any extra information you'd like the listeners to know?
Just using this as a tool to help define your strategic objectives and aid in communicating them across your organization is very helpful. It's also a helpful tool to allow our departments to know what is directly impacting them and what's under their control and what isn't.
Well, thank you. And to our listeners, remember to tune back every first and third Thursday of the month for another coffee break session.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.